Born wolfless, Maeve is the shame of her alpha-blooded family. She is beaten for her unbroken spirit, despised for a weakness she cannot control, and haunted by the silent void where her wolf should be. Her fate is sealed, to be sold as a bride to a cruel, elderly alpha. She is worthless, a tool to be discarded. But on the day of her pack's surrender, the conquering Lycan king arrives. King Corin, the ruthless Iron King, ignores her family's prized warriors. His gaze lands on Maeve, the defiant Omega. Where they see shame, he sees fire. In a move that shatters all protocol, he points to the girl her family tried to erase and declares, "She is mine." Chapter 1. The Shame of Ashwood. The great hall of the Ashwood pack was thick with the smell of roasted meat, stale ale, and a familiar simmering resentment. It was a smell Maeve breathed every day of her life. She moved along the shadows of the wall, her bare feet silent on the cold flagstones. Her tray, loaded with heavy pitchers, was a familiar weight, but the true burden was the hollow space inside her chest. It was a cold, aching void where her wolf should have been. At the high table, her family feasted. Her father, Alpha Valerius, presided with a false, booming joviality that never reached his cold eyes. Beside him sat her brother, Marcus, his broad shoulders slumped in a way that suggested boredom. He was alpha-blooded, strong, and the pack's future. He was everything Maeve was not. She moved to refill his goblet, her eyes downcast. It was the only way to survive. See nothing, say nothing, be nothing. A heavy boot suddenly shot out, catching her ankle. Maeve stumbled, fighting the weight of the tray. The pitchers crashed to the stone, sending dark, foaming ale spreading across the floor like a stain. A cruel laugh erupted from Marcus. "Clumsy filth. Can you do nothing right, wolfless?" The great hall fell silent. Every eye turned to her. Maeve's cheeks burned with a familiar, hot shame. She gripped the edge of the broken tray, her knuckles white. She should have stayed quiet. She should have apologized and cleaned the mess. But the word wolfless was a raw nerve, and her brother had just stepped on it with his full weight. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his. "I may be clumsy," she whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "But at least I don't have to trip omegas to feel strong, Marcus." The air crackled. Marcus's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He half rose from his chair, his hand curling into a fist. But it was her father's voice that struck her, cold and sharp as splintered ice. "Enough." Alpha Valerius rose slowly. He was a large man, but his power came from his presence, not just his size. He looked past his son, his gaze pinning Maeve to the floor. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a genetic stain, a constant living reminder of his bloodline's imperfection. "You will not speak to your future Alpha that way," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You will not speak at all. Your insolence is a disease, Maeve, and I am weary of it." "He tripped me," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her spirit was a pure, suicidal fire, refusing to be extinguished. "It does not matter," Valerius snarled, taking a step toward her. "Your defiance ends tonight. You have brought shame on my name for the last time." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons, and dragged her from the hall. She didn't fight. She had learned long ago that fighting only made the punishment worse. He dragged her across the courtyard, the sharp gravel cutting into her bare feet, and threw her against the base of the shamestone. It was an old, smooth granite pillar in the center of the training grounds, slick with old blood and fresh rain. "You are a burden, girl," he hissed, his face close to hers. A worthless, untamed creature, but no more. Maeve looked up at him, her body bracing for the blow. "Tomorrow," her father said, his voice a cruel promise. "Tomorrow, you will be gone. Tomorrow, your shame finally becomes someone else's problem." Chapter 2. The Old Alpha's Bargain. The cold from the shamestone seeped into Maeve's bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the hollowness inside her. Hours passed. The sounds of the feast faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the lonely hoot of an owl. She remained curled at the base of the pillar, a discarded thing. Finally, the heavy tread of her father's boots on the gravel announced his return. She flinched, expecting the back of his hand, the familiar sting of his displeasure. But the blow never came. Instead, he stood over her, a looming shadow against the moonlit sky. "Get up," he commanded, his voice devoid of its earlier rage, now flat and transactional. She rose slowly, her muscles screaming in protest. He watched her with an unnerving detachment, as if she were a piece of livestock he was evaluating. "I have tolerated your existence for 18 years, Maeve. Your mother's difficult birth, your wolfless state. It has all been a stain on the honor of this pack, a stain on me." Maeve said nothing. She had heard these words, in one form or another, her entire life. They had lost their power to wound, leaving only the dull ache of truth. "But a leader must be resourceful," he continued, a strange, triumphant gleam in his eyes. "He must find a use for even the most flawed of tools. I have made an arrangement, an alliance with the Blackwater Pack." Her blood ran cold. The Blackwater Pack was a day's journey to the north, a hard, brutal pack led by an alpha known for his cruelty. "An alliance requires a bond," Valerius said, savoring each word. "A gesture of goodwill. They have a powerful alpha. He is experienced, a veteran of many border wars, and he has need of a new mate." The world tilted. Maeve stared at him, the unspoken words choking her. He couldn't mean it. Not even he could be that cruel. "Alpha Grom," her father stated, as if announcing a great prize. "He is willing to overlook your deficiency. He finds a fiery spirit appealing, he says, a challenge to be tamed." A cruel smirk twisted his lips. "You will be his bride. You will finally serve a purpose for this family. You will be wed to him by the next full moon." Alpha Grom. The name was a plague whispered in the territories. An ancient wolf, decades older than her father, who had buried 3 wives. A lecherous, possessive brute whose mates were said to live short, miserable lives. She was not being married. She was being handed a death sentence. "You see," her father said, his voice laced with a terrible satisfaction, "even something as broken as you can be of use. You leave tomorrow at dawn. Try not to disgrace me before then." He turned and walked away, leaving her in the crushing darkness, the name of her new owner echoing in the silent night. Chapter 3. The Iron King's Arrival. Dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. It was the morning of her departure, the morning of her end. But the usual sounds of the pack stirring were absent, replaced by a tense, frantic energy that vibrated through the very stones of the hall. Maeve, locked in her small, windowless room, could feel it. The air was thick with a scent she'd never known before. Collective, unadulterated fear. Whispers slipped through the cracks in her door. A runner had arrived in the dead of night, his wolf spent from the journey. He brought news that chilled the blood of even the strongest warriors. King Corin, the Iron King, the Lycan conqueror, was coming. Today. His arrival was imminent. The Ashwood pack was not preparing for a guest. They were preparing for a reckoning. Her impending sale to Alpha Grom was forgotten, a trivial matter in the face of annihilation. Maeve pressed her ear to the door, piecing together the panicked fragments. Corin did not negotiate. He absorbed. He was a force of nature, a pragmatist who saw weakness as an invitation to conquer. Packs that groveled were scattered to the winds. Packs that fought were erased from memory. There was no correct response to his arrival. There was only survival. A horn blared from the watchtower, a single mournful note that cut through the morning mist. They were here. The bar on her door was lifted, and her mother, a woman with eyes as haunted as her own, hissed, "Get out! You will serve at the high table. Your father wants him to see all of his assets." The last word was a sneer. Maeve was shoved into the great hall. It was packed. Every member of the pack stood in rigid formation, their faces pale. The main gates groaned open, revealing the figures standing in the entryway. They were massive, clad in black leather and steel, their faces grim. But they were nothing compared to the one who stood at their center. King Corin was a giant, his sheer size an act of intimidation. But it was his stillness that was most terrifying. He did not move with the restless energy of an alpha. He was utterly, unnervingly still, as if the world moved around him. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept over the hall. It was not a glance. It was an assessment, a weighing of souls. As his gaze passed over them, a wave of submission rippled through the pack. Warriors averted their eyes. Alphas in training bowed their heads. Even her father, Alpha Valerius, could not meet his gaze, his head dipping in an involuntary gesture of fealty. In that moment, he was not their alpha. He was just another wolf, bowing before the apex predator. Chapter 4. The Worthless Tribute. "King Corin, a great and unexpected honor," Alpha Valerius boomed, his voice straining to project a confidence he clearly did not feel. The forced smile on his face was a painful grimace. Maeve moved through the silent hall, a ghost with a pitcher of water. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her entire being focused on becoming invisible. The air was so thick with tension she could barely draw a breath. She could feel the king's presence like a physical weight, a pressure against her skin. He had taken the alpha's seat at the high table without being asked, an unspoken claiming of authority that no one dared to question. Valerius, sweating under his leather tunic, began his desperate performance. "We are a humble pack, Your Majesty, but a strong one. Our warriors are loyal, our lands fertile." He gestured grandly to his children, who stood beside the table. "My son Marcus, the future of our pack, as strong a wolf as you will find in these territories." Marcus puffed out his chest, attempting to look imposing, but the effect was ruined by the slight tremor in his hands. "And my daughter, Lyra," Valerius continued, "swift, clever, of pure alpha blood." Lyra gave a deep, practiced curtsy, her blonde hair falling like a silken curtain. She offered a coy, submissive smile up at the king. Maeve reached the high table, her movements slow and deliberate. She poured water for the king's guards, their stony silence a wall of intimidation. She could feel Corin's eyes on her father, on her siblings. She didn't dare look at him. King Corin said nothing. He watched the pathetic display with an expression of utter, soul-crushing boredom. He picked up his goblet of water, his large hand dwarfing the ornate silver, and took a slow sip. He looked at Marcus and Lyra not as warriors or potential allies, but as one might look at a chipped plate or a wobbly chair. They were insignificant, worthless. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every passing second. Valerius's fawning speech withered on his lips. Lyra's smile faltered. The entire pack held its breath, waiting for the king's verdict. Finally, Corin set his goblet down. The soft click of silver against wood sounded like a thunderclap in the tomb-like quiet. He leaned back in his chair, his storm-gray eyes moving from Marcus to Lyra, and then settling on Valerius with chilling disinterest. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any emotion, yet it vibrated through the very foundations of the hall. "Is this the best your pack has to offer, Valerius? Fawning pups who reek of fear?" Chapter 5. A Spark in the Ashes. The king's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Humiliation, stark and absolute, washed over Alpha Valerius's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his fawning speech utterly dismantled. The scent of his fear was sharp, a sour note in the suffocating atmosphere of the hall. Maeve continued her duties, refilling goblets, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She had to stay invisible. Today, of all days, she could not be seen. She moved away from the high table, toward the lower benches where the pack's lesser members sat. The collective shame of her pack was a palpable thing. They had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. A young Omega servant, a boy named Finn who couldn't be more than 12, nervously approached the high table with a fresh pitcher of wine. His hands trembled, his eyes wide with terror. He had to pass Marcus. Her brother, his face still flushed with anger from the king's insult, was looking for a target, anyone weaker upon whom he could vent his fury. He saw Finn. As the boy drew level, Marcus shot his boot out. It was a lazy, contemptuous movement. Finn, his eyes fixed on the king, never saw it coming. He went sprawling, the heavy ceramic pitcher shattering on the flagstones and sending a river of deep red wine across the floor. A cruel, ugly laugh escaped Marcus's lips. "Useless," he snarled, loud enough for the high table to hear. "Can't even walk straight." The other servants flinched away, terrified of being associated with the accident. But Maeve didn't hesitate. She was at Finn's side in an instant, helping the trembling boy to his feet and checking to see if he was cut. She looked at the shattered pitcher, then at her brother, and the carefully constructed walls of her control crumbled into dust. She stood, her small frame rigid with a fury she could no longer contain. Her eyes, burning with defiance, locked with her brother's. "He's not the one who spilled it, you clumsy ox," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was as clear and sharp as breaking glass. It sliced through the hall's thick tension, and a collective gasp rippled through the assembled pack. Every head turned, every eye fixed on her. To speak out of turn was a punishable offense. To insult the Alpha's heir in front of a visiting king was unthinkable. It was a death wish. King Corin, who had been staring blankly at the wall opposite, deep in his own bored thoughts, slowly turned his head. His movements were deliberate, economical. His gaze, sharp as a shard of ice and impossibly intense, swept past the humiliated Valerius and the snarling Marcus. For the very first time since he had entered the hall, his eyes landed directly on Maeve. And in their cold, stormy depths, a dangerous flicker of something new, a spark of genuine interest, began to burn. Chapter 6. She is mine. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was so total that Maeve could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart, a terrified drum against her ribs. Her father's face was a mask of purple, apoplectic rage. He was beyond words. He simply began to move, his hand raised, not for a simple slap, but for a blow that would teach her the ultimate lesson. This was the end. He would break her, right here, in front of the king, to prove that he could still control something in his own hall. Maeve braced for the impact, her eyes squeezing shut. "Stop!" The word was not a shout. It was a low, guttural command, vibrating with a power that shook the very stones. It did not ask for obedience, it took it. Alpha Valerius froze in place, his hand still raised. He looked like a statue, his rage trapped and curdling into fear. King Corin rose from his chair. He was not just tall, he was a mountain of a man, and his shadow fell over the high table, extinguishing the light. He was not bored anymore. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on Maeve, alight with a predatory fire that was more terrifying than his indifference. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his lips, revealing a hint of canine. He walked past the trembling, fawning Lyra. He ignored the bristling, impotent rage of Marcus. He stopped directly in front of Alpha Valerius, who was forced to crane his neck to look up at the Lycan king. "You present your fawning pups as tribute," Corin said, his voice a soft rumble that everyone in the hall could hear. He gestured dismissively at Marcus and Lyra. "They are worthless. You offer me your strength, but I see none." His gaze shifted, moving past Valerius to Maeve. She stood, small and defiant, her chin still high, her entire body trembling but her will unbroken. He pointed a single, black-gloved finger directly at her. Her. Valerius stared, his mind unable to process the command. "What?" he stammered. "Her? Your Majesty, she is a servant, a flawed, wolfless omega. She is the only one in this hall who doesn't reek of your pathetic fear," Corin countered, his eyes still locked on Maeve. "She is the only one with a spine of steel. She is the only thing of value you have." He turned his gaze back to Valerius, the smile dropping from his face, replaced by the cold, pragmatic mask of a conqueror. He did not ask. He stated, "She is mine." Chapter 7. The Severance. The king's declaration echoed in the stunned silence. "She is mine." 3 words that sealed Maeve's fate as surely as her father's bargain with Alpha Grom. But this was different. This was not a sale. This was a claiming, a conquest. Alpha Valerius's face cycled through a bizarre spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning, profound humiliation. To have his prized children dismissed was an insult, but to have his family's greatest shame, his wolfless daughter, claimed as the only thing of value, that was an indictment. It was a political execution. "Your Majesty," Valerius protested, his voice cracking, "surely you jest. The girl she is broken. She is wolfless. She is worthless, I assure you." This was, Maeve knew, the worst possible thing he could have said. King Corin's head tilted, and a look of profound, chilling contempt settled on his features. He looked at Valerius as if he were something slimy he had found on his boot. "You would not know value if it bit you, Valerius. You have sat in this hall, surrounded by weakness. For so long, you have mistaken it for strength." He did not look at Maeve again. He simply gestured to the largest of his guards, a man with a scarred face and eyes as dead as chips of flint. "Kale, take her." The guard, Kale, moved. He was brutally efficient. Maeve didn't have time to react before his hand clamped around her upper arm. His grip was like an iron manacle, lifting her from her feet. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her defiant shock. "No!" she cried out, her feet scrambling for purchase. "You can't!" Marcus, seeing his sister, his property, his plaything being taken, surged forward. "You can't just take her!" he bellowed, his rage finally overriding his fear. Kyle didn't even pause. With his free hand, he backhanded Marcus across the face. The sound was a wet, sickening crack. Marcus crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the flagstones. The message was clear. They were not equals. This was not a negotiation. Kyle began to drag Maeve toward the door. She looked back, her eyes desperate, searching the faces of her family. Her mother looked away, her face pale. Her sister, Lyra, watched with wide, jealous eyes. And her father. Her father just stared, his mouth open, his power completely and utterly broken. They were not her family. They were just the people who had owned her first. The great hall doors were pulled open. The cold morning light flooded in. Maeve was dragged across the threshold, and the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, plunging her future into darkness. Chapter 8. The Iron Citadel. The journey was a blur of misery. She was not treated as a guest, but as cargo. Kyle, the silent, scarred beta, had thrown her onto the back of a horse with all the gentleness of a man loading a sack of grain. He'd bound her wrists to the saddle horn and mounted his own steed, taking her horse's reins. She was a prisoner, led in a procession of silent, black-clad warriors. King Corin rode at the front, never once looking back. They rode hard for hours, climbing out of the damp lowlands of her home into the harsh, wind-swept peaks of the north. The air grew thin and bitingly cold. By the time they arrived, Maeve was numb, her body a single throbbing bruise. The Iron Citadel was not a home. It was a threat carved into the very peak of a mountain. It was a fortress of black basalt and dark iron, its towers scraping the low-hanging clouds. It loomed over the landscape, a monument to power and intimidation. There were no banners, no colors, just stone, steel, and snow. She was half carried, half dragged through massive, echoing halls. The air was cold but clean, smelling of iron and high-altitude ozone. There was no rot, no stale ale. It was the smell of efficiency. Armed guards stood at attention in every alcove, their eyes following her, but their faces showing no curiosity. They were disciplined. They were terrifying. Kyle finally shoved her into a room and released her bonds. Her wrists were raw. He pointed to a figure standing by a fireplace. "He will see you tonight. Do not disappoint him." He turned and left, the heavy door locking behind him with a definitive, metallic thud. Maeve stood, trembling, in the center of the room. It was a cage, but it was the most beautiful cage she had ever seen. A massive fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand in. The bed was piled high with thick black furs. A bathing pool steamed in an adjoining chamber. A quiet servant, an older woman with a face like etched stone, motioned to the bath. "The king commands you to bathe and dress?" the woman said, her voice a monotone. She held up a gown of deep emerald silk. Maeve did as she was told, the hot water stinging her raw skin, washing away the grit of the road and the scent of ashwood. She dressed in the silk, which felt alien against her scarred skin. She was a stray dog in a queen's jewels. Alone, clean, and utterly terrified, she stood by the fire, waiting. The door opened. She didn't turn, expecting the servant. A deep voice rumbled from behind her. "You are clean. Good." She spun around. King Corin stood in the doorway, filling it completely. He had shed his armor, and in the firelight, he looked less like a king and more like a primal predator. He had come to see his new possession. Chapter 9. The Tyrant's Court. King Corin stared at her, his expression unreadable. The firelight played over the hard planes of his face, making his storm-gray eyes seem to glitter. Maeve's hand instinctively went to the unfamiliar silk at her throat. She was a mouse presented for a wolf's inspection. "You will come with me," he said. It was not a request. He turned and walked, not waiting to see if she would follow. She scrambled after him, her bare feet silent on the heated stone floors. He led her from the private wing into the main artery of the citadel. It was a cavernous hall, but unlike the one at Ashwood, it was not filled with drunken feasting. It was filled with purpose. Dozens of werewolves, all hard-bodied and battle-scarred, moved through the space. They were betas and alphas from conquered packs, their wild energy now tamed and forged into a single disciplined weapon. As Corin passed, they stopped, bowing their heads in perfect, respectful unison. Then, they saw her. The whispers started instantly. Maeve felt their eyes on her like 1,000 tiny needles. She was small. She was wolfless. Her scent was wrong. No wolf, no power, just omega and human. And she was walking behind the Iron King, dressed in silks, fit for a queen. She was an anomaly, an equation that didn't balance. She saw the contempt in the eyes of the female warriors, the cold calculation in the eyes of the conquered alphas. They arrived at a smaller, elevated dining hall. Kale, the scarred beta, stood guard outside the doors. His gaze landed on Maeve, and his lip curled in a silent, fractional sneer. "My king?" Kale said, his voice a low growl. He pointedly ignored Maeve. "Your council is waiting. The situation with the Red Fang borders is deteriorating." "They can wait," Corin replied, not breaking his stride. He pushed the doors open. Inside was a large table, but it was set for only two, facing each other across the expanse of dark, polished wood. Kale stepped partially into the doorway, his disapproval a palpable force. "My king, is this wise?" He pressed, his voice low so only they could hear. "She is an ashwood omega, a runt. To bring her here, to elevate her, it will be seen as a vulnerability." Corin stopped and turned his head, his gaze so cold it seemed to freeze the air. A vulnerability, Kale? A distraction, Kale bit out. A pet. You took her on a whim. Our enemies will see it as a weakness. Maeve held her breath. Kale was naming her exactly what she was. A whim, a pet. She was the weakness that would get them all killed. Chapter 10. The First Confrontation. The air in the dining hall crackled, thick with the unspoken challenge. Kale stood his ground, a beta loyal enough to speak a hard truth to his alpha. But King Corin was not just an alpha. He was a Lycan. His authority was absolute. Corin's gaze remained fixed on his beta, the silence stretching until it became a weapon. Your counsel is noted, Kale, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly soft rumble. And it is dismissed. Leave us. Kale's jaw tightened. For a second, Maeve thought he might argue further, but the sheer, crushing weight of the king's command was too much. He gave a stiff, formal bow, his eyes flicking to Maeve one last time with pure, unadulterated loathing, before he turned and pulled the doors shut, leaving them alone. The silence that descended was heavier than Kale's presence. Servants, moving like ghosts, entered from a side door. They placed platters of roasted meats, dark bread, and spiced wine on the table, then vanished just as quickly. Maeve stood by her chair, not daring to sit, not daring to move. Corin took his seat at the head of the table. He motioned for her to sit opposite him. Eat. Maeve sat on the edge of the ornate chair. She was starving, but her stomach was a tight knot of terror. She stared at the food, her hands clenched in her lap. He watched her for a long moment, not eating, just studying. You are not what he said you were, Corin observed, his voice startling her. Maeve looked up. What? What did he say I was? Worthless, broken, flawed. He leaned forward, lacing his large hands together on the table. He was wrong. Maeve's heart hammered. She didn't understand. This was not the behavior of a man who had claimed a pet. This was an interrogation. Why did you speak? He asked, his voice sharp. In the hall. She swallowed, her throat dry. She had to answer. She had to give him the truth. The boy, Finn, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was terrified. My brother. He enjoys hurting things that can't fight back. A foolish suicidal move, Corin stated, echoing her own thoughts. You defied your future alpha in front of his entire pack. Why? Maeve met his gaze. The defiance that had been her curse was her only shield now. Because it was the truth, and I am tired of watching bullies win just because they are strong. The words hung in the air. A dangerous, almost imperceptible smile touched the king's lips. Tired of bullies, he mused. He leaned back, regarding her with a new, sharper intensity. My court trades in strength. Fear is merely the byproduct. You, however, you do not seem afraid of me. You should be. I am, Maeve admitted, her voice shaking slightly. I've been afraid my entire life. I'm just tired of it. Corin let out a short, sharp huff of air. It was almost a laugh. Good, he said, the word a sudden judgment. Fear is for the weak. Now, Maeve of Ashwood. He leaned forward again, the amusement gone, replaced by the cold, assessing gaze of a strategist. Your father, Valerius, he is a fool. Tell me why. Chapter 11. Whispers and Daggers. The king's question hung between them. Tell me why. He wasn't asking for an opinion. He was demanding an analysis. Maeve's terror began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. This was a test. He wasn't a brute like her father. He was a hunter, and he was testing her mind. My father is a fool, she said, her voice gaining a small measure of strength, because he cares more about the performance of strength than strength itself. He postures. He bullies omegas. He talks of pure bloodlines because his own pack is weak, and he has no other victories to claim. He would rather sell his own daughter than admit she is wolfless. Corin watched her, his expression unreadable, letting her words settle in the quiet room. And his son? Marcus? He is the same, Maeve said, a bitter taste in her mouth. A bully. He only knows how to punch down. He has never been challenged. He is exactly the alpha my father deserves. For a long moment, Corin simply stared. Then, he finally picked up his own knife, sliced a piece of meat, and began to eat. You see clearly, he stated. It is a rare quality. He gestured for her to eat. You will need your strength here. My court is not like your father's. They are not fools. They are predators I have forced into a single cage. They will not bully you. They will try to destroy you. Maeve's hand trembled as she picked up her fork. She was a lamb in a den of lions. The next few days proved his words true. Her presence at the king's side was a disruption of the highest order. She was a wolfless omega, a runt from a weak, newly absorbed pack, yet she slept in the royal wing and ate at the king's table. She was an insult to the hierarchy. The whispers followed her everywhere. When she walked the cold, grand halls, the conquered alphas and their families would stop their conversations, their eyes dissecting her. She heard the words they thought she couldn't. The king's new pet. A wolfless whore. A sign of weakness. She had no allies. The servants, sensing her anomalous and dangerous position, avoided her. The warriors, especially Kale, looked through her. Even the other Omegas who served in the kitchens and cleaning quarters treated her with a mixture of fear and resentment. She was not one of them, but she was not one of the elite, either. She was a third, alien thing. One evening, as she returned to her chambers, she found her way blocked by two towering, broad-shouldered alphas from a northern pack. Their scents were sharp, like pine and aggression. The king's little mouse, one of them sneered, his eyes roving over her silk dress. Tell us, what tricks does a wolfless omega perform to keep the Iron King's bed warm? Maeve's heart hammered, but she kept her face blank, attempting to sidestep them. The other alpha blocked her path. He must be truly desperate to claim such damaged goods. Leave me alone, she said, her voice quiet. Or what? The first alpha laughed, reaching out to grab her arm. You'll cry to your new master? His fingers were inches from her when a voice, cold as the mountain peak, cut through the hall. I would not do that, Ulfric. The alphas froze. King Corin stood at the end of the corridor, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He hadn't raised his voice, yet the threat was unmistakable. The alphas paled, bowing deeply. My king, Ulfric stammered. A misunderstanding. Was it? Corin asked softly. He walked toward them, his steps silent. He stopped beside Maeve, his gaze fixed on the two terrified alphas. She is under my protection. If you or any other wolf in this citadel touches her, whispers her name, or even looks at her in a way I deem disrespectful, I will not banish you. I will simply end you. He turned his gaze to Maeve. Are we clear? The alphas nodded, bowing again before scrambling away. Corin looked down at Maeve. This is your life now, he said, his voice flat. Learn to fight or learn to die. Chapter 12. The King's Test. The encounter in the hall was a brutal lesson. Corin had not saved her. He had merely protected his property. His warning had silenced the overt threats, but it had only intensified the covert ones. The whispers became colder, the glares sharper. Kale, in particular, now looked at her with undisguised contempt. He saw her as the reason his king had been forced to show his hand, to defend a weakness. 2 days later, Corin summoned her. You will come with me, he commanded, finding her in the vast, empty library. Where? She asked, her voice small. To my council. Panic, cold and immediate, seized her. But I am not. I don't know anything about... I did not ask for your opinion, he cut her off, his voice impatient. I told you to listen. You see clearly. Now, you will watch. He led her to the war chamber, a circular room dominated by a massive stone table carved with a map of the territories. His inner circle was already assembled. Kale, 3 other grim-faced alphas, and an older female wolf with scars that rivaled Kale's. They all stiffened when Maeve entered behind the king. My king, Kale said, his voice tight with disapproval. This is a private war council. And she is my guest, Corin replied, his tone forbidding any further argument. He took his seat at the head of the table. Proceed. Maeve stood in the shadows behind his chair, trying to make herself small. The council began, their discussion sharp and brutal. They spoke of the Red Fang Pack, a rival group on the eastern border that was raiding supply lines. 2 alphas, named Corin and Valak, argued for an immediate, overwhelming assault. Kyle argued for a more measured approach to fortify the border and wait. They are rats, my king, Corin insisted, his fist hitting the map. They prey on our supply wagons because they are too cowardly to face us. We must ride out and crush their den. Valak nodded. My scouts report their main force is thin. They are stretched, vulnerable. Now is the time to strike, before the snows deepen. Kyle shook his head. It is a trap. The Red Fangs are not fools. They are luring us out. We should secure our territory first. Maeve listened, her mind racing. She watched the alphas. Corin was loud, all bluster and rage. Valak was quieter, more precise, agreeing with Corin's conclusion but not his emotion. She watched his hands as he spoke. He traced the route of the supply lines, but his gaze kept flicking to a different location on the map, a narrow pass far to the south. They are weak, Kale, Valak said, his voice earnest. My contact within their pack confirmed it. Their alpha is sick. Corin, who had been listening in silence, turned his head slightly. Maeve. The entire room froze. Kale looked as if he'd been struck. You have been silent, Corin said. What do you see? Her blood turned to ice. Every eye was on her. I do not know these lands, my king. I did not ask about the lands. I asked what you see. He pressed, his voice deceptively calm. She had to answer. She looked at the alphas. Alpha Valak, she said, her voice trembling. He is lying. Kyle let out a snort of derision. She is an Omega. What would she know of— Silence, Corin commanded. His eyes bored into Maeve. Explain. When he spoke, Maeve said, forcing the words out, he spoke of the Red Fangs in the east, but his eyes, they kept looking south, to the Fellwinter Pass, and his hands. He is clenching them, but not in anger, like Alpha Corin. He is clenching them in fear. He's not telling you to attack. He's praying you will. A terrible, heavy silence fell. Valak had gone pale as death. Corin's eyes narrowed on him. Valak, your family is held at Fellwinter Pass, aren't they? The Red Fangs have them. And they told you to feed me this lie, to send my armies east, leaving the pass undefended so they could take it. Valak collapsed from his chair onto his knees. My king, my mate, my pups. They said they would kill them. Corin stared at the traitor for a long, cold moment before looking at Maeve. He said nothing, but his eyes held a new, sharp glimmer of respect. She had seen what his alphas, blinded by their own senses of power and strategy, had missed. She had seen the human, wolfless truth. Chapter 13. A Crack in the Iron. The aftermath of the council meeting was swift and brutal. Valak was dragged from the room, his fate sealed. Kale and the other alphas looked at Maeve with a new, grudging, and slightly terrified respect. She was not just a pet. She was a weapon. That evening, Corin did not summon her to the dining hall. Instead, a servant brought a simple tray of food to her chambers. Hours later, long after the moon had risen over the citadel, her door opened. Corin entered, not as a king, but as a shadow. He had dismissed his guards and was dressed in a simple black tunic. He walked to the large arched window, looking out at the snow-capped peaks glittering in the moonlight. "You saved me a great deal of trouble today," he said, his back to her, "and a great many lives. Kale's pride is wounded, but he is a pragmatist. He will see your value." Maeve sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap. "I just saw he was scared." "You saw what they were trained to ignore," Corin corrected, turning to face her. "They see strength and weakness. You see truth." He walked toward her, his presence filling the room. He stopped just feet away, his gaze analytical. "You are not like them. You are wolfless, and yet you are not weak. You are something else." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an asset or a curiosity, but as a person. "Your family," he said, his voice dropping. "They beat you for that spirit, didn't they?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it stole her breath. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He reached out, his hand moving slowly as if not to spook a wild animal. He gently touched a faint, silvery line on her collarbone, a scar barely visible above the neckline of her shift. It was from her brother's training dagger. Maeve flinched at the contact, but his touch was surprisingly light, his fingers calloused but not rough. His gaze darkened. "Who?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "My brother," she whispered, her throat tight. "Marcus." His thumb traced the scar, and a jolt, not of fear, but of something else. A strange electric warmth shot through her. His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation or predatory interest. She saw a deep, primal, and terrifying rage. It was not the explosive, uncontrolled anger of her father. It was a cold, focused fury, and it was for her. "He hurt you," Corin stated, his voice flat. "They all did. They took this fire, and they tried to stamp it out with stones and leather." He stepped back, his face closing off again, the Iron King mask slamming back into place. But the crack had been visible. The control had slipped. He looked at her, a strange, possessive light in his eyes. "They will not hurt you again," he vowed. "No one will." He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Tomorrow, you will begin training. Not with the warriors, with me." Chapter 14. Scars and Steel. The next day, Corin did not take her to the training grounds. He took her to his private armory, a room filled with weapons that looked more like works of art than tools of war. Swords, axes, and daggers lined the walls, all crafted from dark, gleaming steel. "You have a mind that can cut," he said, running his hand along the hilt of a massive broadsword, "but your body is weak. Your father kept you underfed, unskilled. Here, weakness is a disease. We will purge it." Maeve looked at the terrifying array of weapons. "I can't lift those," she said, her voice small. "I know," Corin replied. He walked to a smaller, velvet-lined case. He opened it, revealing a set of perfectly balanced, wickedly sharp daggers. They were crafted from the same dark steel, their hilts wrapped in tight black leather. He picked one up. It was light, fast, and deadly. "You will not fight like them," he said, gesturing to the hall, where the sounds of sparring alphas echoed. "You will not meet force with force. You will meet it with speed and precision. You will be the razor in the dark. This is how you will survive my court." He placed the dagger in her hand, her fingers wrapped around the hilt. It felt cold, heavy, and balanced. It felt right. "Your first lesson," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Never let anyone close enough to see you coming." For weeks they trained. Every morning before the citadel was fully awake, he would drill her in the armory. He was a relentless, terrifying teacher. He did not coddle her. He pushed her, throwing her to the mats, disarming her and forcing her to get up again and again. He was teaching her how to kill. One morning, after a particularly brutal session, she lay on the mat, gasping for breath, her entire body a tapestry of new bruises. He stood over her, his own breathing not even labored. "Get up," he commanded. "I can't," she wheezed. "You are not allowed to be weak," he growled. "Get up." She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her muscles screaming. He watched her, his face impassive. "Again!" He lunged. She, fueled by exhaustion and a spark of rage, didn't try to block him. She did what he had taught her. She ducked inside his reach, twisting, and brought the blunted training dagger up toward his ribs. He caught her wrist in a grip of steel, stopping the blade an inch from his body. They were frozen, chest to chest. His scent, snow, iron, and a primal musk, filled her lungs. Her heart hammered against his. He was so solid, so warm. His eyes locked on hers. He had not expected the move. She had surprised him. He released her wrist, stepping back. A slow, approving nod. "Better." He motioned to a bench. "Rest." She sat, her body trembling. He retrieved a water skin. As she drank, his gaze fell on her back. Her training tunic was damp with sweat and had ridden up, exposing the scarred skin beneath. His face hardened. He reached out, his fingers tracing the worst of the marks, a thick, ropey scar from her father's whip. "He did this," Corin stated. It wasn't a question. Maeve flinched and pulled her tunic down. "It doesn't matter. It's in the past." "The past is never gone," Corin said, his voice dangerously soft. "It is a weapon, or it is a chain. You will make it your weapon." He reached to his own belt and unhooked a sheath. He tossed it to her. It was the mate to the dagger he had given her. "You have a spine of steel, Maeve," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is time you had steel in your hand to match it. Always." Before she could respond, the great bell of the citadel began to toll. It was not the call for a meal or a meeting. It was the alarm, the sound for gates breached or high delegation. Cale burst into the armory, his face grim. "My king, a delegation has arrived, from the Ashwood pack." Maeve's blood ran cold. Corin's eyes narrowed. "Valerius." "No," Cale said, his eyes flicking to Maeve with a new, dark meaning. "Your brother, Marcus, and he has brought a guest." Cale paused, letting the weight of his words land. "Alpha Grom of the Blackwater Pack. He has come to collect his stolen property." Chapter 15. The old threat returns. The name hit Maeve like a physical blow. Alpha Grom, the lecherous old brute. The death sentence her father had signed for her. She had been so focused on surviving the Iron Citadel that she had forgotten the simple, brutal fate that she had escaped. Now, it had followed her here. "He is here?" she whispered, her hand instinctively tightening on the dagger Corin had just given her. Corin's face was a mask of cold fury. He looked at Cale. "Where are they?" "In the Great Hall, my king," Cale replied, his voice tight. "They are insistent. Grom is claiming a breach of contract, that you stole a bride that was already pledged to him." "Stole," Corin repeated, the word a low, dangerous rumble. He looked at Maeve, at the terror in her eyes. The cold, controlled mask of the king was slipping, revealing the possessive, primal Lycan beneath. "Get her cleaned up. Bring her to the hall. She will face this." "My king," Cale hesitated, "is that wise? To show her? Grom is using her as a provocation." "She is not a thing to be hidden," Corin snarled, his voice dropping. "She is the reason they are here. She will be the one to see them leave. Do it." Kyle nodded stiffly and motioned for Maeve to follow. She was taken back to her rooms, her body still aching from the training. The servants dressed her, not in training leathers, but in the fine silks of her new life. They brushed her hair, their hands trembling slightly. They were dressing her for a confrontation, for a judgment. She walked to the great hall, her new dagger strapped to her thigh, hidden beneath the deep emerald silk. Cale walked beside her, his silence a heavy weight. As they approached the massive doors, she could hear voices. One was her brother's, arrogant and loud. The other was a wet, gravelly sound that made her skin crawl. Kyle pushed the doors open. The hall was filled with Corin's guards, a silent wall of black steel. In the center stood Marcus, his face still showing the faint, yellowing bruise from Cale's backhand. He looked arrogant, but his eyes were shifty, nervous. Beside him stood a wolf she had never seen, but she knew him instantly. Alpha Grom was old, yes, but he was not frail. He was a thick, gnarled oak of a man, with a heavy gut and a long, gray-streaked beard stained with old wine. His eyes, small and black, immediately landed on Maeve. They were wet, possessive, and utterly repulsive. A slow, lecherous smile spread across his face, revealing yellowed teeth. "Ah," he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "There she is, my little bride, finally." Maeve's hand went to the hilt of her dagger. Corin stood near the high throne, his arms crossed, watching. Marcus stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "King Corin, we have come to right a wrong. You took what was not yours. This Omega was pledged to Alpha Grom as a sign of alliance between our packs. You stole his property." "Property," Corin repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Yes," Grom interjected, taking a step toward Maeve. "She belongs to me. I have the contract, signed by her father. She is my wife, and I have come to claim her." He held out a gnarled, demanding hand. "Come, girl, your tantrum is over." Chapter 16. The Ashwood Conspiracy. The great hall of the Iron Citadel was a cold, cavernous space, but it had never felt so oppressive. Alpha Grom and Marcus, having made their initial demand, were not imprisoned. In a move that stunned his court, King Corin had given them guest quarters. "They are a delegation," he had stated, his voice flat. "They will be treated as such until their claim is answered." This act of civility was a match to dry tinder. Grom and Marcus did not wait. They began to work. Maeve, cloaked in the invisibility of her former rank, watched it all. She saw her brother, his false bravado fully restored, corner 2 alphas from the southern territories. "He claims to rule by strength," Marcus said, his voice just low enough to be conspiratorial. "But he broke a sacred pact, a blood contract. What does that make his word to you worth?" The alphas, their faces grim, did not disagree. She saw Alpha Grom, his lecherous gaze a constant weight, holding court near the fire pit. He was more cunning than her brother. He didn't speak of honor, he spoke of weakness. "A fine fortress," he rasped to a group of warriors, gesturing at the iron-wrought walls. "But its master is distracted. He sets aside matters of state, border skirmishes, all for a wolfless Omega, a flawed pet. It shows a lack of focus, a softness. The Iron King, it seems, has begun to rust." The whispers spread like a plague. "A wolfless pet. He broke a contract. He is soft." Maeve felt the shift in the Citadel's atmosphere. The hard-won, grudging respect she had earned was evaporating, replaced by suspicion. She was the focal point of the king's perceived weakness. Cale's jaw was perpetually tight, his gaze on Corin filled with a frustrated disapproval. This was not just about getting her back. Marcus was too stupid to see it, but Grom knew exactly what he was doing. He was painting Corin as an oathbreaker, a king ruled by impulse, a leader who would steal a worthless Omega, and in doing so, prove he was unfit to rule them. The conspiracy was not a quiet plot. It was a loud, public campaign of slander. Every warrior who heard Grom's words, every conquered alpha who listened to Marcus's claims of injustice, began to doubt. Their loyalty to Corin was new, forged in fear and pragmatism. Grom was offering them a reason to break it. He was handing them a justification for rebellion. Maeve realized with a chilling certainty that her father and Grom had not sent Marcus here to win. They had sent him here to lose, but to lose in a way that would make Corin look like a tyrant and a fool. This was a carefully orchestrated move to destabilize the entire Dominion. Chapter 17. The Wolfless Spy. The court was a tapestry of shifting loyalties, and Maeve was the only one with the freedom to move between the threads. No one paid attention to the king's pet as she refilled a wine goblet or stood in the shadows of a corridor. She was furniture. And furniture, she had learned, hears everything. She needed to know the true endgame. This was more than slander. There had to be a concrete plan. That evening, she followed Marcus. He was too arrogant to be discreet, his heavy steps echoing toward the guest wing. He entered Grom's chambers without knocking. Maeve pressed herself into a cold stone alcove across the hall, the shadows swallowing her whole. The door was thick, but her brother was loud. "Not enough," Grom's gravelly voice rumbled. "The whispers are good, but we need a flashpoint." "What more do you want?" Marcus snapped, his voice petulant. "We've told everyone he broke the pact. They are listening." "Listening is not acting," Grom snarled. "We need to force his hand. We need to make him prove he is a tyrant. Tomorrow at the midday meal I will demand a formal public answer, in front of his entire court." "And he will refuse," Marcus said. "Of course he will, you idiot," Grom replied. "And when he refuses, when he dismisses a sacred blood pact, that is when you will stand and call for a vote of no confidence. You will appeal to the other conquered alphas. You will remind them that his rule is unjust, his word is worthless, and his power is illegitimate. Alpha Ulfric and the others, they are already primed. They are ready." Maeve's blood ran cold. Ulfric, the alpha who had threatened her. This was not a simple rebellion. This was a coup, orchestrated from the inside. "You will demand he be stripped of his title," Grom continued, his voice slick with triumph. "And in the chaos, I will take what is mine. Your father will be rewarded for his part, and you. You will have your vengeance on your sister, and on him." A plan. A precise political blade aimed at Corin's throat. They weren't just trying to make him look weak. They were planning to use his own laws of assembly against him, to incite a full-blown insurrection in the middle of his hall. Maeve didn't wait to hear more. She slipped away, a ghost in the vast, cold fortress. She knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't just tell Corin. She had to show him how to win. Chapter 18. The Queen's Gambit. Maeve did not go to Kael, who would have dismissed her as a paranoid Omega. She went straight to the King's Solar, a room she had never entered. The two iron guards at the door crossed their spears, blocking her way. "The king is not to be disturbed," one said, his voice flat. "He will see me," Maeve said, her voice shaking but hard. "Tell him it concerns Alpha Ulfric." The name was a key. One of the guards disappeared inside. Seconds later, he emerged, his face grim. "He will see you." Maeve entered. Corin stood before a massive stone map, the one from the war room, his back to her. He did not turn. The fire was the only light, casting huge, flickering shadows. "You have 5 minutes to explain why you invoked that name," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They are planning a coup," she said, the words spilling out. "Grom, Marcus. They are just the face. Ulfric is the true threat. They are using the broken pact as a pretext to incite a rebellion." She didn't just report, she analyzed. "They plan to force a public answer from you tomorrow. When you refuse, Grom, Marcus will call for a vote of no confidence, appealing to the other conquered alphas. Ulfric and his allies will support it. They intend to strip you of your title in your own hall." She stepped forward, into the firelight. "They want you to refuse. They want you to act like a tyrant. If you execute Grom, you prove their point. If you ignore him, you look weak. They've built a perfect trap. Corin finally turned. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had underestimated the scope of their ambition. "And what do you suggest, Maeve?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "You, who sees so clearly." This was her test. Her mind raced, pulling the pieces together. "Don't refuse them," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Give them exactly what they want. You won't look like a tyrant if you're following the law." He frowned. "Explain." "A full assembly," she said, her mind working faster now. "Call the entire court, not for a meal, but for a formal public judgment. You call it, not them. You control the narrative. Let them make their claim in front of everyone. Let them present their sacred contract and their evidence." "And then?" Corin rumbled, his eyes fixed on her, a strange, intense light dawning in them. "And then," Maeve said, her voice dropping, "you let me answer them." A slow, terrible, and utterly proud smile spread across the Iron King's face. He had claimed her as a pet, an impulse. He had trained her as a weapon. But now, in the firelight of his war room, he looked at her as something else entirely. An equal. "Do it," he said to Cale, who had been listening from the shadows. "Summon the entire court. Dawn. They will have their judgment." Chapter 19. The Grand Hall. Dawn broke, cold and sharp. The Great Hall was not set for a meal. The long tables had been pushed to the walls, leaving a vast open space before the high throne. It felt less like a hall and more like an arena. Every alpha, every beta, every warrior of rank within the citadel was present, their faces grim and uncertain. They had been summoned for a formal judgment, and the tension was a physical coiling thing. Maeve stood in the shadows near the throne, just as Corin had instructed. Cale stood on his other side, his hand on his sword, his eyes scanning the crowd. Corin sat on the throne, a mountain of black steel and silent power. He looked bored, as if this were all a tedious formality. "Bring them in," he commanded. The great doors opened, and Alpha Grom and Marcus were marched in, flanked by guards. They looked surprised by the scale of the assembly, but their surprise quickly turned to arrogance. This was it. This was their flashpoint, delivered to them on a platter. Marcus shot a triumphant, hateful glance at Maeve. "Alpha Grom of the Blackwater Pack, Marcus of the Ashwood Pack." Corin's voice boomed, echoing in the silence. "You have come to my citadel. You have made a claim. You have spread your grievances in my halls. Now, you will speak them in the light." He gestured to the open floor. "The floor is yours." This was perfect. It was more than they could have hoped for. Grom, his face slick with sweat, stepped forward, holding the parchment aloft. "King Corin, I stand before you as an alpha of an old and honored pack. I came for what is mine, and I found your hospitality lacking." He unrolled the contract. "I hold here a sacred, blood-signed pact with the Ashwood Pack. The Omega Maeve is my pledged bride. You stole her. You broke a sacred law. I demand she be returned to me, and I demand compensation for this insult." Marcus stepped forward, his voice ringing with a false, practiced righteousness. "King Corin, you took our pack, but you do not own our blood. My sister was promised. Your claim is meaningless against a prior sacred pact. The Alphas gathered here. They know the law. They know honor. I ask you, how can you rule them when you break the very laws that bind us?" The hall was dead silent. The two had made their case. The challenge was laid. Ulfric, standing near the front, watched Corin, a smug, expectant look on his face. The trap was set. Now, they waited for him to step into it. Chapter 20. The Omega's Voice. King Corin watched the two challengers, his expression unreadable. He let the silence stretch, forcing every alpha in the room to consider the accusation. He let the weight of the broken pact settle on their shoulders. He saw Ulfric shift, preparing to make his move. He saw the doubt in the eyes of his court. Grom smiled, a wet, triumphant curl of his lip. He had won. The king was trapped. Corin finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on the arms of his throne. "You have spoken of contracts," he rumbled. "You have spoken of honor. You have spoken of her." His gaze shifted from Grom, moving past the alphas, past Kale, and settled on the figure standing in the shadows beside him. Maeve. The name dropped into the hall like a stone. Every eye snapped to her. She was not a prisoner. She was not a pet. She was at his side. "You have heard the claim," Corin said, his voice deceptively calm, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "You are the subject of this sacred pact." He inclined his head, a gesture of profound and shocking deference. "Speak." It was a single word, but it was an earthquake. It shattered every rule of their society. An alpha, a king, asking a wolfless omega to speak in judgment. Maeve stepped out of the shadow. Her hands were not bound. She wore no chains. She was dressed in fine, dark wool, the dagger he had given her visible at her hip. She looked for all the world like his consort. She did not look at Grom or Marcus. She looked at the assembled alphas. "I have heard this claim," she said, her voice clear and steady. "A sacred pact between Alpha Grom and my father, Alpha Valerius." She turned her gaze on Grom, and her lip curled in a mirror of his own sneer. "You say I was pledged to you. You are correct." Grom's smile widened. Marcus looked confused. "I was," Maeve continued, "sold to you, like a milk cow, like a broodmare, in exchange for weapons and a strip of land. That is the honor of the Ashwood pack." She began to pace, her small form holding the attention of the entire powerful room. "But a contract, as every alpha here knows, has terms. It requires all parties to be in good faith. You, Alpha Grom, and my father, Alpha Valerius, made your plan. But you made a mistake. You thought I was just property. You didn't realize I can listen." She stopped, her gaze landing on Alpha Ulfric. His face had gone pale. "I stood in the halls of this citadel," Maeve announced, her voice ringing, "and I heard your true plan. You, Alpha Grom, and you, Marcus, conspired with members of this very court." She pointed a steady finger at Ulfric. "With him!" Ulfric roared in denial. "She lies! A wolfless witch!" "I heard you," Maeve shouted, her voice overriding his. "I heard you plot to use this pact as a pretext, to call for a vote of no confidence, to incite a rebellion and strip your king of his title. You did not come here for me. You came here for his throne." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Grom and Marcus were frozen, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated terror. The trap had just been sprung, not on Corin, but on them. Maeve, the wolfless omega, had just exposed their entire conspiracy, and in doing so, had signed their death warrants. Chapter 21. The King's Judgment. The echo of Maeve's accusation, "You came here for his throne," hung in the dead cold air. The trap was sprung, the conspiracy laid bare. Alpha Ulfric, his face a mask of purple rage, knew he was lost. He roared, a desperate primal sound, and lunged. "She lies! Traitors to me! Kill the tyrant!" The two guards at the door, the ones Maeve had seen signal, drew their steel and charged, not at the throne, but at the nearest threat. Kale. Ulfric, however, was no fool. He knew the true target. He bypassed the cowering Grom and Marcus, his long, serrated dagger flashing as he charged the high throne, aiming for the king. Chaos erupted. But Corin was not a werewolf alpha. He was a Lycan. He did not rise from his throne in a panic. He moved. He was a black blur, intersecting Ulfric's charge with terrifying economical speed. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply caught Ulfric's knife hand by the wrist. The sound of a dozen bones snapping echoed through the hall, a sharp, wet crack. Ulfric screamed, his dagger clattering to the stone. Before the sound died, Corin's other hand was around his throat, lifting the struggling alpha from the floor. Across the room, Kale met the charge of the two traitors. It was not a fight, it was an execution. His blade was a silver whirlwind, and in two precise, brutal movements, both guards lay dead. In the confusion, Grom, his face contorted in agony and fury, saw his entire plan crumble. It was all because of her. "You," he spat, his lecherous gaze turning to one of pure hatred. "You worthless, wolfless bitch!" He surged forward, lunging for Maeve, his hands clawed, aiming for her throat. Maeve did not scream. She did not retreat. Her training took over. As Grom's weight descended, she did not meet his force. She ducked inside his reach, twisting her body, and drew the dagger from her thigh. She was a razor in the dark. She lunged upward, plunging the blade deep into the thick, unprotected meat of his thigh. Grom bellowed, a high, strangled sound, and his leg collapsed beneath him. He crashed to the floor, clutching the wound as dark blood pumped between his fingers. The hall fell silent. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Corin dropped Ulfric's lifeless body, his neck broken. He turned, his chest heaving, his Lycan gaze sweeping the room. He saw his dead traitors, Kale bleeding but victorious, and Maeve standing calm and steady, her bloody dagger held low, her foot planted near the moaning, defeated Alpha Grom. A terrible, cold pride filled his eyes. He turned to the stunned court. "This," he boomed, his voice a gavel, "is the fate of traitors." His gaze found Grom. "You will not die in my hall. Kyle, bind his wound, just enough to stop him from staining my floor." He looked at the guards. "Throw him on his horse. He is banished. If he survives the ride to Blackwater, tell his pack their alpha is a groveling coward who was brought down by a wolfless Omega." Finally, his gaze landed on the whimpering, paralyzed Marcus. Corin sneered in disgust. You are not worth the steel. You will return to Ashwood. You will tell your father, Valerius, that his pack is dissolved. His title is stripped. His bloodline is forfeit. He will live out his days as an Omega, cleaning the filth of the pack he failed. Corin surveyed his court, his voice dropping to a dangerous vow. "I am the Iron King. What is mine I keep, and what threatens mine is erased." Chapter 22. My Queen. The great hall was cleared with ruthless efficiency. Guards dragged the bodies of Ulfric and the traitors away. Grom, moaning and cursing, was hauled out to meet his bleak fate. Marcus, his bladder having failed him, was thrown from the citadel gates, his long walk back to Ashwood a sentence of pure shame. The conquered alphas and betas of the court did not move. They stood silent, watching their king. The failed coup had not weakened him. It had cemented his power. But their gazes were not only on Corin. They were on Maeve. She stood where she was, her bloody dagger still in her hand, her knuckles white. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a deep, bone-shaking tremor behind. She had faced her tormentors. She had exposed a plot. She had taken a life. Kyle, his arm being bound by a healer, approached the throne. He stopped, not just before Corin, but before them both. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound, hard-won respect. "The hall is secure, my king." His eyes lifted to Maeve. "My lady." Corin nodded. "Clear the hall. Leave us." One by one, the alphas and betas filed out. Their fear was still present, but it was mingled with a new, potent awe, aimed directly at the small, wolfless woman who stood beside the throne. The great doors boomed shut, plunging the vast hall into the quiet of the aftermath, broken only by the crackle of the hearths. Maeve and Corin were alone. The political tension had vanished, leaving a new, crackling energy in its wake. He was not bored. He looked at her, and his internal conflict, the boredom, the craving for a challenge, was gone. He had not claimed a pet. He had found his match. He walked to her. She looked up, her two bright eyes wide, her face smudged with dirt, her dress stained with blood. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He gently, his large calloused hand covering hers, took the blood-stained dagger from her grasp. She released it, her fingers trembling. He did not toss it aside. He slid it carefully back into the sheath on her thigh, his touch lingering, possessive. "They saw a wolfless omega," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. It was not the voice of the king. It was the voice of the man. A flawed pet, a broken tool. He lifted his hand, his thumb brushing a smudge of grime from her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to the hollow place inside her. "I saw fire," he whispered. "I saw steel. And I saw the only wolf in this entire dominion worthy of standing beside me." A sudden, sharp jolt, like lightning, passed between them. It was a recognition, a snap. The long-dormant, unspoken, fated mate bond, which he had claimed by force and she had earned by will, slammed into place. Maeve gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The hollow, aching void where her wolf should have been. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was warm. It was full. Corin's silver eyes blazed, his Lycan recognizing its mate. "They called you worthless," he growled, his voice thick with a raw, primal possession. "I call you my queen." He leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers. It was not a kiss. It was an anointing, a claiming, a promise. The bond sealed, and for the first time in her life, Maeve felt whole. Chapter 23. The true claiming. The sealed bond was a roar in Maeve's blood. It was a wave of warmth, of power, of belonging so profound it buckled her knees. Corin's hands were there, steadying her, his grip firm on her arms. She was no longer a separate, broken thing. She was part of him. The terror she had lived with her entire life simply evaporated, burned away by the heat of his claim. He looked at her, truly seeing her, and she saw him. Not just the Iron King, but the Lycan who had been just as isolated as she was. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Come," he commanded, but it was no longer the order of a master. It was the request of a partner. He led her from the blood-stained hall, through the stone corridors, past his own royal solar, and to the massive iron-bound doors of his private chambers. He pushed them open, leading her inside. It was a room built for a warrior king. It was vast, Spartan, and dominated by a massive, unadorned stone hearth and a bed piled high with the furs of black wolves and northern bears. The air was thick with his scent, iron, snow, and a deep primal musk that now felt like home. He closed the door, the heavy thud sealing them away from the world. The political tension was gone, replaced by a thick, heavy silence that vibrated with their new awareness. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a silver light she had never seen before, the light of his wolf, his true self, finally unleashed. "I have been king for a long time," he confessed, his voice rough, as if the words were torn from him. "I am surrounded by cowards who bow and traitors who plot. I have been bored. So profoundly bored, Maeve. For decades." He stepped closer, his gaze tracing her features as if memorizing them. "And then I saw you. In that pathetic, decaying hall. A little wolfless thing, covered in filth, with more fire in your eyes than my entire army." A harsh, short laugh escaped him. "You spat in your alpha's face. And in that moment I wasn't bored. I finally felt alive." He touched her face, his thumb tracing her jawline. "I took you as a prize," he admitted, his voice dropping. "An impulse. I told myself you were a shiny object. I was wrong." "I am not your prisoner," Maeve whispered, her new strength, their strength, flowing through her veins. "No," Corin growled, his control finally definitively breaking. He pulled her against him in one swift motion. His massive, hard body enveloped hers. She was so small, yet she felt like his equal. You are not my prisoner. You are not my pet. He buried his face in her hair, his voice a possessive, desperate rumble against her skin. You are my equal. You are my mate. You are mine. He lifted his head, and his mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a devouring. It was a raw, primal expression of a king's need and a Lycan's hunger, and she met it not with submission, but with her own untamed fire, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. This was not a bargain. This was not a pact. This was the true claiming, a clash of iron and fire that would forge a new crown. Chapter 24. The Iron and the Fire. The Iron Citadel was no longer cold. 6 months had passed, and the fortress, once a place of black basalt and silent dread, had changed. There were tapestries on the walls now, depicting not just battles, but landscapes. The great fires burned brighter. The atmosphere was no longer one of mere submission. It was one of fierce, protective loyalty. The change was most evident in the great hall. Corin sat upon his throne, but he was not alone. Beside him, in a chair of equal height, carved from the same dark ironwood, sat Maeve. Cale, his loyalty absolute, gave his report on the border patrols. The Red Fangs are silent, and the Blackwater pack has scattered since Grom's accident. Your judgment on the Ashwood territories was enacted, my king. He then turned his head, his gaze respectful. My queen, your new trade route proposals for the southern farmlands are ready for review. Thank you, Cale, Maeve replied, her voice clear and confident. We will review them tonight. A new delegation was brought in, an arrogant, untested alpha from a coastal pack. He swaggered to the center of the hall, his eyes fixed on Corin. I speak only to the king, he announced, gesturing dismissively at Maeve. My business is with the alpha. The hall fell silent. Corin leaned back in his throne, a look of profound, familiar boredom settling on his features. He laced his hands over his stomach. Then you will have no one to speak to. My queen handles all initial negotiations. She has a rather keen eye for liars. The alpha flushed, but he heard the nervous shifting of the court. He had heard the whispers. He turned, stiffly, to Maeve. Maeve leaned forward, her gaze sharp, her wolfless advantage on full display. You come offering tribute, she said, her voice cutting through the hall. In exchange for our protection against the sea raiders. A fair offer, on its face. She picked up a single piece of parchment. But your ledgers, which you so helpfully provided, tell a different story. Your trade routes are not rated. They are failing. Your tribute is a pittance. You do not offer us fealty. You offer us your debts. The alpha's face went pale. She had dissected his entire bluff in under a minute. We will not accept your debts, Maeve declared, her judgment final. You will cede control of your northern port. You will accept my trademasters, and we will restore your routes. In exchange, we will take 60% of the profits. You will have our protection, and you will learn not to lie to us again. The alpha, humbled and defeated, bowed low. My queen. Later that night, Maeve stood on the high battlements, looking out over the snow-capped peaks. The air was sharp and cold, but she felt only warmth. A pair of massive arms encircled her from behind, pulling her back against a hard, familiar chest. Corin rested his chin on her head, his rumble vibrating through her. The court fears you, you know, he murmured, his voice laced with pride. Maeve smiled, leaning into his embrace. Good, they should. But they respect you. No, Corin corrected, his voice dropping, his lips finding the sensitive skin behind her ear. They respect us. She was no longer Maeve the wolfless, the shame, the broken thing. She was Maeve, the fire queen. The hollow space inside her, the one that had ached for a wolf, was gone. It was filled now, overflowing with the power of the bond, the strength of her intellect, and the love of her mate. The Iron King had found his match, and the Iron Citadel, at last, had a heart.